The amount of things you have to think about before you get like a lecture started, you take it for granted. Like I gotta make sure my notification center says like no notifications, because the amount of times I've been embarrassed with like some kind of message on Slack or something during lecture. Hopefully that works. I don't feel like doing too much troubleshooting. Okay, let's see if we can get that fixed. Ah, there we go. That should do it. Come on. Yeah, just getting it full screened. And then full screen that, get rid of the dock, good there. And probably bigger font, right? Something like that. All right, we are ready to get started. Audio is working okay. I mean, we don't have a satellite cohort, but it's nice to get those recordings, right? I don't know if you guys watch them or not, but it's always nice to watch the previous ones or whatever. So welcome. Today is Thursday already. Holy shit. I'm at 62% battery, which means at the break time, I'm going to go fetch my battery power. If I don't, please remind me. Otherwise, we're going to have an issue after the break. So yeah, welcome to Thursday of week 2. I bet you week 1 feels like a little bit of a blur. Like, what did we cover last week? Have I been here for a year? I always make the joke about how, like, oh, I forgot to prepare a joke, like a proper joke. Anyway, I always make the joke about how, like, a 12-week bootcamp, it almost feels like every couple weeks is like a semester of college or university. Like, it's just so much stuff crammed in, right? That it definitely feels overwhelming and condensed version of a semester or two. You guys feel that way yet? Not yet? If you don't, you will feel that way pretty soon. So what are we doing today? Today is actually one of the more difficult concepts to cover in one lecture. And the truth is that we won't fully cover it in one lecture. We're going to be talking about promises, which are a really, really big, huge part of many asynchronous languages, especially JavaScript. Okay, so recently, as of like Tuesday, I want to say, we've started with callbacks. And it's no understatement that callbacks also are a very, I forgot to silence my phone, that reminds me. Callbacks also are a very, very big part of how we do programming with asynchronous languages. We've started to appreciate that a little bit with some of the networking stuff that we've done. So we learned a little bit of networking and asynchronous stuff all together, since networking is something that is quite asynchronous. Is that fair to say? I think we did some file system stuff with FS, right? Like another I/O input-output thing, very similar to networking, except it's on the disk. Takes some time, and so we want to use callbacks to deal with that. Not all languages use callbacks. For example, with Ruby, we don't, as you'll see when you get to that. Because Ruby is a little bit more, I guess it's a little bit easier in that way, in that you don't get that callback control flow stuff to figure out. You don't have to deal with promises and things like that. But JavaScript is way more prominent than Ruby these days. And there are many other asynchronous languages that use promises and callbacks. So it's not like a JavaScript-only thing that you're learning here, right? I guess maybe what I'll do before I even get into expectation setting is a little bit of review, not too much. Right, so I've already spoken to this a little bit, but can somebody else tell me why callbacks? It's okay, like high level, why callbacks? Why do they exist? Why do we need them? Well, first of all, what are they? Function that's passed into a variable? As a variable, yeah. Passed into another function as a variable or argument, right? Why? Or rather, do you want to add more what first?
There are functions that are called when a specific action has been done.
And why do we do that? Because that sounds annoying, right? Like when A is done, I want B to happen, right? Like A is done, A function is done, then B. That's how code should be executing. First line, then second line. But JavaScript, for certain things, doesn't work that way, right? Why is that? Yeah, we don't know how long it will take A to complete, and JavaScript does not want to wait. That's the big thing, is JS, specifically as the way it's built internally, does not like to be blocked by A, right? We'll just put that up here as code. JavaScript does not like to be blocked by A, and so we instead give it B as the thing to do next, right? So we give A, B, instead of A and then calling B ourselves, right? Is that fair? Everybody feel comfortable with that in terms of what? So I guess this is kind of more the why, right? JavaScript does not like to be blocked by A. Why is that, by the way? Anybody want to, this is a little bit more advanced, but anybody want to talk about like what makes it not want to wait? Why is it that it must do things with the callbacks as opposed to kind of how Ruby does it, which is you call A and then you call B. It doesn't matter if A is a file system or a network thing. It doesn't matter. It'll wait, right? It makes things simpler, yeah. It's a good guess, but no, it doesn't have anything to do with that, as far as I know. The guess was, does it have to do with how it like does multi-pass? It reads the code twice, actually. Maybe, but that's not the main reason.
It executes line by line.
All languages try to execute line by line. You don't want the second line to execute before the first one. It is by design, and there's been something specifically by design. So this is called a concurrency model. Okay, different languages have different concurrency models. So this is not a buzzword, but a keyword for you to write down to Google in terms of JavaScript concurrency model, because there's a lot of people that try to explain it on various different posts, and most of them get it right? So you will have to read a few of these articles on, it's not an easy topic, concurrency models, right? And JavaScript has a specific one, which is basically event-based. Right? And more specifically, it's called the event loop. So these are just words I'm giving you to read up on maybe on the weekend if you're feeling comfortable, or even after you graduate. It's not going to stop you from being able to do the things as long as you're able to use the tools like callbacks and promises, right? You don't, as we can probably appreciate by now, we don't need to fully understand how everything works in order to be able to build applications, right? We don't even fully understand how TCP works, right? Like how are packets actually sent and what are the different layers, but we're able to get some stuff done, right? So similarly, these are just things for you to, if you're really curious about more not the theoreticals, but the underlying technologies, these are the things to look into for this stuff. It would take me a lecture to try and explain this, and it would be foolhardy because it'd be too early and it wouldn't really add value in terms of, moving further. So that's why I'm not doing that. Okay, so what is the lecture going to look like then? First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're learning promises now, even though they're pretty advanced and we don't need to learn them now. Then we'll get into what kind of problems they solve. We're going to use one specific problem that they solve, which is called callback hell, and we'll go into that a little bit. Then we'll actually look at what that problem looks like solved with promises. And this is something I'm doing differently with this lecture. I've done this lecture many times. I'm trying to do something different because it's never perfect, because it's such a hard lecture. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a promise-based solution earlier on, like right away. Be like, this is what it looks like, and then we'll dissect what promises are. So it's like a little bit of a preview. Then we'll do some whiteboarding in terms of let's take a look at what promises do. So going back towards how they work. And then what we'll do, so that's this, how do promises work? Hopefully 15 minutes on that. And then we're going to practice another problem that this time it won't just be code on the screen for you to read. We'll actually create a problem solution using callbacks first. So that's something we'll hopefully be more comfortable with. And then we'll recreate that solution again, spending another 20 minutes with promises. So the first time I show you this stuff, it'll be like existing code right here, this review and this. That's why it's only 12 minutes approximately, because we'll just look at code. I'm not writing anything there. And then we're going to get into, okay, now let's again, right, instead of just going advanced now and building on that, let's do another problem that's similar, but let's do it with callbacks and then with promises. Is that a good idea? Hopefully. We'll find out, right? So expectation setting, yeah. So promises are one of the hardest things to learn early on. Once you learn them, it's like, oh, I don't understand why it's so hard. But just because of the fact that they're solving not one problem, but like 3, 4 different problems, it's hard to introduce promises. Which problem do I start with? And some of the other problems they solve are more esoteric. They have to do with automated testing. Words like composability are used. What does that mean? Hard to get into this early on in your learning journey. So why the hell are we covering promises now when you could argue for starting them in the latter half of the program, when you're more comfortable with JavaScript? And this is something I had to deliberate quite a bit as we were reworking our entire curriculum, moving from 10 weeks to 12 weeks. So this was another thing that got completely redone. In fact, all of week 1 and 2 were completely redone. Most of it is written by me, if you want to blame someone. And I decided that promises were going to be introduced. So before, in the 10-week version, promises were not really formally introduced until like much later in the program. And I found that students were, by the time they graduated, not comfortable with promises. So my goal is, by the time you graduate, you're comfortable with promises. That's my goal. By comfort level, I mean comfortable with using promises. There's 2 sides of promises. You're going to use libraries that use promises, and then you're going to you have the potential of creating promises yourself, like actually creating a promise. We're going to not. I don't know if you'll be fully comfortable with that by the time you graduate. Maybe stretch goal, but at least the using libraries that work with promises as a developer, that's like 80% of where you're going to encounter them. I want you to be comfortable with that by the time you graduate. So I want to start early, because by the end of today, you probably won't be comfortable with them. Just like we started on objects earlier, it takes a while to fully be able to master objects. Not just key value pair, I got it, but like when do you use them? How do you use them? Not just syntax, but like the right times to use them, right? So things of that nature. So do not expect by the end of this lecture, let alone by the end of this day, to feel comfortable with promises. Even though we're going to move on from it, you might be like, so we covered it, we moved on, now I'm going to start forgetting that shit. You won't, because pretty much every week that follows this week, you're going to use promises. In your midterm project, you're going to use promises. In Tweeter, you're going to use promises. In TinyApp, I want to get there, but we're not. So next week, it may not be that you exactly get to use promises for the core material. I want to improve that a little bit. But I try to make promises a continuity throughout the whole program, so that by the time you're doing final projects, it's like, yeah, I can use any library that uses promises. No big deal. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so let's actually get right into it. So callback hell. Who can tell me what callback hell is? The usual hand goes up right away, so I'm going to wait a little bit, because I'll ask Jay if no other hands go up, but I'd prefer to see other hands go up as well. It's Jay, right? That's the right name? Yeah. Terrible with names. Yep, yourself name? Alice, yep.
It's when you have like callbacks nested.
Yeah, it's when you have callbacks nested. Nested callbacks, and this happens why? Yes, because one relies on the other. That's exactly it. Which is another way of saying we want to get something synchronous done, this, then this, then this, then this, but we're being forced by the library or the language to use callbacks because it's asynchronous. So we're trying to do some asynchronous stuff synchronously, right? Why is it asynchronous? Oh, because JavaScript makes any kind of I/O asynchronous. In this case, it was could be reading from the file system, right? That's gonna have to use callbacks because Node's not gonna. Well, that's not entirely true. Node will allow you to use like a synchronous function, but you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you're trying to build a web server like that. It'll basically not work very well. In fact, you know Proctologist, the thing that you use for. Do you guys know what Proctologist is? Well, we know what a proctologist is. It's a doctor of but we have this test proctor that you do on Friday, right? The test that you have on Friday that you did. You had one already, right? Yeah, last Friday. When we did the server for that, it kept failing. And when I looked into the code, it turns out that the developer decided to use read file sync. And that's the synchronous version of reading a file. And when everybody was trying to basically download all the test files, it would start randomly failing for certain people. Why? The queue was just getting too big because it was only able to serve one request at a time. So there's an example of what happens, a real world example of what happens when you use read file sync and try to serve 20 people at the same time in Node, because Node is a single event loop. It can only do one thing at a time, and if you basically see read file sync, it will take its time to read that file, and nobody else is able to even connect, right? Those TCP connections are going to get rejected, essentially. We had that problem. But anyway, coming back to what I was saying, we're trying to do that async thing with read file, or read line in the case of the profile generator. We're trying to do those async things, but in a synchronous way, because I need this, then I want to ask them this, then I want to ask them this, and then I want to ask them that, right? And so we see that with the profile generator right here. This looks familiar, I assume, from 2 days ago, from like a year ago, where you were using standard in to ask questions. Does this look familiar to most of you? Did your code inevitably end up like this in some way or form? This kind of waterfall or hell of callbacks, right? Because this particular logic is inside of this callback, and so on. And a certain amount of nesting, like 2-3 levels in, maybe I can handle that, right? So it's not necessarily that we have to stop using callbacks and collapse that into one level. But promises do help us do that. So I'm going to show you, this is new for me in terms of how I'm doing my lecture. I'm going to show you what a solution to this looks like. You can assume that this will run. This is actually a student's code that I just took and reformatted a little bit. But this is what the promises version looks like. So we're again using readline. Is everybody able to see this? Right? And the goal, as you can imagine, is to just get rid of that staircase or that waterfall. Right? We're still going to have callbacks, by the way. It's not like we're completely eliminating callbacks. It's just how we use them is no longer in a nested way. Okay? Maybe I'll write that down, because sometimes people get confused about that. Callbacks are still used with promises, just not the crazy staircase, waterfall, whatever you want to call that hell, right? So let's look at it again. So you'll notice it uses readline, but not the same readline that the other one was using. It's using a different version of readline that works using promises. So first of all, we can't use the same library, right? Or if we are using the same library, it has to have a different function that I'm calling because it behaves differently, right? And the biggest difference you'll notice is on line 10, which is, of course, repeated because we ask many questions, right? Not just the name of the function, question async. What is structurally different about this line? And not looking at line 11, specifically line 10, that function call. What is different about that compared to, you'll have to in your head remember what the other line was. Your name in the back? Ali? No, the dot then is the next line. What's different about line 10? Line 10 specifically, what's different? The function name is different, sure, whatever. It's just a different function name. As opposed to? Exactly. The other one took 2 arguments. It was like, give me the callback as well as the thing that you want to ask. Right? That's what you were going to say, Jay? Yeah? That's what you were going to say? Exactly. So let's do a quick review of that. 0A survey. Notice this is a callback function, an arrow with an arrow function syntax, right? 2 arguments. Here, 1 argument. And what that allows us to do, what that does is, in just that one line, it has no idea what to call after, but it needs to know. But we didn't pass it in. So what's interesting is we do that after. We do that after with the dot then, as you were saying. We say dot then, and here's the callback. So I mean, it's not that much different, right? We need to provide 2 things. We just don't do them at the same time. And that gives us apparently some kind of superpower that allows us to not have to nest these callbacks. It's not just that one attribute, but that one attribute combined with a couple other attributes about promises allows us to do that. And in terms of what the code ends up looking like, I'll just keep it on line 10 there. As you can see, there's still callbacks, right? And quite a bit of code. In fact, you could argue there's more lines of code in this. But what do you notice that's different? It's cleaner in one respect, which is that, which is what? The indentation, right? The nesting of logic. right? For me, I know I'm kind of reading this top down again. Even though there's some nesting, it's only one level in, right? And also the dot then kind of prompts me to think, yeah, this is like this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, right? Whereas that's not obvious to a newcomer or even an existing JavaScript developer with so much nesting on the other solution. Do we agree? Pretty cool, eh? So yeah, this is kind of like the preview. Let's run it, see, make sure it works, and then we'll talk about. And so how it's working is, it's asking. It's slightly different than the other one. The other one, in terms of logic, didn't have an array at the beginning. It just keeps each variable with a different name, and because of nested scope, we just use all of the. We just use all of the variables at the end, right? But this solution. So there's no array collecting all the answers. This solution does something a little bit differently, which is, you know what? On the outer scope, let's keep an array of all the answers, and then we'll keep pushing the answers into the array, and then we'll just index the array. Right? That's one of the other differences here that Promises kind of forced us to do, which isn't necessarily bad. I could have done that with the other one too. Right? Yep, Jay?
So like in the other one, you didn't have to keep something from the higher scope. Like here you have.
No, you don't have to do it this way here. It's just cleaner. If I try to show it to you where I was passing that data through, in Promises it gets a little bit uglier.
Okay.
But it's possible.
So it's recommended that we do something like this when you use Promises.
No, I'd say the question is it recommended that I do it this way? No, I'd say it just gets uglier in terms of like learning it. It's not. You could argue this is less elegant because I'm having to maintain state above. So it's just I didn't want to introduce another thing and have to explain that, right? So it was more of a learning experience thing improvement versus a code quality improvement. Yeah. So just in case you didn't understand, Jay was just asking, are you forced because of Promises to do this way? And the answer is no. It's just I want to keep things simple. So yeah, let's run it. And we can see that it does work. What do you think of Node.js? What's your favorite activity? I'm lying, but oh yeah, teaching. There we go. I like it. What do you listen to while doing that? I don't know how to spell his name. I just put him on all the time now. Ludovico Einaudi, Italian name. Which meal is your favorite? I hate brunch. I don't understand brunch. Like, why was brunch invented? Why would I go out to a restaurant to order, like at a nice restaurant, and then I hate it. Like I sometimes go for lunch on a Sunday, and then I find out it's a brunch menu, and I'm like, so basically, this nice restaurant is going to give me poached eggs. Great, I could do that at home. So not brunch for sure. Let's go with dinner. Favorite thing to eat for that meal? I don't know. Which sport is your absolute favorite? Honestly, I do not like sports, so let's go with esports.
Oh yeah.
Even though those are not my favorite either, I don't watch esports. So there we go. That works, right? It works just the same, but our code was simpler, right? Which is nice. I would say any questions, but I'm sure the questions would basically be, yeah, how is that working, right? But any questions aside from that about what I've built up so far, like about callbacks, and do you question that this is a better flow? Not exactly. Okay. Oh yeah, so note the separate npm module. So we could even quickly bring up the npm module, perhaps. So let's do, what was it called? Readline? Readline in JavaScript with Promises. Let's see what comes up. And you'll have to do something like that for other libraries, because maybe you at work are using a library and it's using callbacks, and you're like, I'm going to switch this over to Promises. You know, you want to find out, does that library support Promises? Is it on the same library? Is it a different library? So on. Yeah. This is a drop-in replacement for readline with additional promise-based methods like map, reduce, and for each. Uses a custom something. Of course, if you want the default behavior, you can use the default behavior. So it's like, why even use the other one? Because this one gives you both behaviors. That's pretty cool. And by the way, this is one of the gotchas of the JavaScript ecosystem. Notice that they're using import, not require, in their example code. We are imploring you to not use import yet, right? There's a specific reason. Yes, it's better, more modern, and all of that. We'll get to it. We're not going to completely ignore it. You're going to use require, so be careful with these examples. And then, yeah, same idea, interface. And then, they're using for each. That doesn't really help. Yeah, there it is. Question async, and then answer, right? They talk about that, and then, you can look at that documentation. Cool. So I think what I'll do next is this section here. How the hell does that work? So I'll keep the code up here, which is right there. And I guess what I'll tell you is at the end, near the end of the lecture, we'll also create a promise. So we actually see the code behind how to create a promise, or like return a promise. Like, how does this function actually return a promise? How does this readline function actually work? But we'll do that at the end because that's less needed. Usually we're using functions that return promises. So we just want to understand them at a high level, how they work, but not implement them. So let's take a stab at explaining what a promise is. So first, an analogy. And like any analogy, it's not going to be a perfect fit. But the analogy that I liked of all the ones that I've heard is the analogy of a mortgage. Right? Because things move fast when you're getting a house, I'm sure we can all relate to buying a house in Vancouver. I know I don't own one. But whatever, we understand mortgages, I think, right? Right? So you don't actually go and get the money, wait for that money to actually land in your bank account in order to buy a house. The full money, whatever it is. What are houses are at this point in Vancouver? Like, 1 point, whatever they are, right? What do you do instead? Yeah. Yes, the bank buys it, but ultimately they're loaning you the money, right? They're a loan provider. But normally when you do a loan, like if you were to do a business loan, you actually get the money in your account. But mortgages are different. Yeah, but first step is you get the money, then you give it to the seller, usually, right? But in this case, with mortgages, they don't work that way. When you go to the bank and you sign all the documents, they don't hand you a briefcase full of cash to say, okay, now you can go buy the house. What do they do instead? They just give you a document. And the document, or email, or whatever that is, PDF, basically says that you are approved for that mortgage, right? It's like a promise of money. Right? And while you don't have the money, that letter itself means something valuable because it's like, I almost have the money. And now people are going to, because it's coming from a place of authority, are going to be like, okay, like, yes, there's a chance it doesn't come through, like, the whole economy collapses, but we'll take that risk and say, we're ready to move forward with assuming that you'll have the money to buy the house. Right? So it's like an intermediary kind of thing that represents the completion of the actual thing that you want, which is the money to buy the house. Do you see that? That's what a promise kind of is in JavaScript. It's like you call that function, and I mean here we're not asking for money, we're asking a question from the user, and it's saying I will ask the question, right? And it returns immediately, just like the one that takes callbacks, right? It returns immediately. So so we have to then, using that thing that comes back, we can then say, okay, but once that happens, I would like this to happen. Now I can go to the bank. Oh, sorry, now I can go to the agent and move forward with the purchase. Right? So that's the analogy. Right? Keep that in the back of your minds. How does that actually work? Well, when I call a function that takes in a callback, I knew this would happen. Here we go, that's better, right? When I call a function, ff, and I pass in some string, and normally with callbacks, I pass in some callback. And whatever, there'd be code in here to do the thing that happens after, right? I just didn't nest it because I don't have limited space here. What does this function actually return? The callback version, not the promise version. Usually, not always, but what is it? What do you think it returns? Take a guess. You were going to say something? Some kind of value? Probably not, because it doesn't need to return anything. Whatever it's going to return is going to be in this callback. So undefined is usually the right answer. And you had to take a guess because you never checked, right? You're like, I don't really care. It's going to be the thing comes in into the callback. Undefined. I hope I spelled that right. With the promise version, what do you think you get? Because, I mean, you could probably make an assumption based on line 11, which, yes, it's nested, but it's not actually nested. It's just calling .then on the return value of that function call. Do we agree? It's just for readability that it's nested inside. It's not like a curly bracket or anything like that. It's right at the end of that, right? But for readability, we move it like that. So actually, let me actually make this a little bit more. What this is actually doing is, read line dot question, pass in the question, Q1, dot then, right? And then there's a function, a callback function to do the next thing, right? But what's nice is, inside of the next thing, we're not doing another nested promise call. We're leaving that nesting only that far, and then we're adding more .thens afterward. Except that instead of putting them all on one line, we've moved them to be vertical. But literally, this is what's happening. .then is a chain on the previous result of the .then. Do you see that? Right, like line 20's .then is literally right after this one here. So what do you think, coming back to my question, what do you think is the result of the function question async, which returns not undefined? What do you think it returns? No, because the next question is on us to ask, right? It doesn't know that you want another question. It returns, it doesn't ask the question right away because that takes some time, right? It's an asynchronous operation. But it's like, okay, I'll get started on this, right? And then it gives us something back so that we can work with it. It doesn't give us back undefined. What do you think it gives back? You have to take a guess. Jay wants to take a guess. Happy to ask Jay, but Jay always has his hands raised. Question async does not return the next question. It doesn't know that you want to ask another question. It just knows that you want to ask the first question. Well, that's what the callback version does. But look what I did on line 13 in this case. I called .then on the thing that was returned. When I see a dot something on something, when I see a .then, function call, what is that on? It's on an object. So what I get back here on the other version is an object. Is that what you were going to say, Jay?
Yeah, but I don't know what that. Like, I just assume it's an object containing. Because when you do .then, you have one parameter, and that's the answer, right? So maybe that object contains the answer. Like, I have no idea. I'm just as clueless.
That's fine, but you answered the first question correctly, which is an object. But you should be able to answer this question correctly, even though you're uncertain about this, what you just said. What things are on the object? What things are on the object? What properties, right? Things being properties, because objects are key value properties, right? What properties are on the object? There's at least one that you can name based on the code that you're seeing. This is me wanting you to think like a dev. You don't know what promises are, but you can tell about what kind of objects they are by looking at the code that's using them. Nope. There's no answer. I'm not saying the return value of this, if you would know it has an answer property if I did this. It has a then property, right? Do you see that? Because the first thing I do when the object comes back is I call .then on it. Can somebody find me another freaking marker? Hate this. I don't know why I didn't prep properly for this. Sorry about that. Always get burnt with the markers. Ah, nice. Yeah, so .then is the property. Thanks for trying. Do we agree with all that? Right? This is the approach that I talked about in my previous lecture. Like, I want you to start thinking critically about code that it's always going to be something new, but you can start making some assumptions. okay, this function returns an object because we're calling .then on it. I can assume it's an object. And I know that it at least has the property .then. So let's get back to what promises are. Promises are objects, as you can imagine now. We know that. And we also know promises are objects that have at least .then on them. Right? I guess that represents the object. That's what we get back. Right? And what is an object again? Aside from just key value pair, like what does it mean in terms of object-oriented programming? What is object at a high level? Container, exactly. That's why I drew a box. And what does it contain? Data. Data's fancy word is state, right? And behavior, functions. Yeah. Right, so this is your data. And this is your functions. It's already going. Bullshit. Right? So this object does have state. It starts with one state, and that state is pending. Because your mortgage loan is pending, right? But it depends on how long it's going to take. If you're trying to send a gigabyte file, right, over the network, maybe it's local or whatever, it's not going to be within a few milliseconds. It's going to be within a few seconds these days, I guess, or within a few minutes, right? And so it will stay in that state for that long, okay? But you get the object right away, and you don't go .state on it, right? You don't try to like see what is its state, but internally it has a state, okay? And that state can go from pending to another state. Can you guess what it is? Again, completed. Yeah, it's actually fulfilled. Your mortgage has been fulfilled, right? There are other synonyms for it, but fulfilled is probably the most commonly one that's referred to, but you can think of that as completed, successfully completed, right? And then, as you can imagine, there's another thing that can happen. Yeah, exactly. The other one is rejected. I know, they're kind of harsh terms, at least that one. Like, why did it have to be that? It could just be failed, but I guess failed is just as bad.
Fulfill can be resolved as well?
Fulfilled, the other synonym for it is resolved. Yes, I guess you know a little bit. But actually what I would say is that the transition is what is called resolve. So you resolve a promise so that it becomes fulfilled. You see the difference? But I mean, these are just semantics. I don't really care, right? So this is resolving it, saying, right, good. And this is, I guess, rejecting it. I'm not really sure. I don't get hung up on the terminology too much personally. Some people are very dogmatic about it. It's more important that you understand that this is a state machine. That's a term you might want to write down. That's something I learned formally in university. There's theories behind state machine. We're not going to get into those. But a promise is a state machine in that it is a finite amount of states with transitions from one state to the other. It's a very simple state machine. It can literally go from one state to one of possible two states. You can have very complicated state machines. Right? So if you want to Google and write down and Google state machines later, stretch, I don't care if you do or not for now. It is something that's used quite a bit. You just don't necessarily need to call them that, right? Anything that has state and that the state keeps changing based on some transition functions is a state machine, right? Yeah? And so when we get back this promise, initially, if we were to like just look at it in that moment in time, it would have the status of pending. In fact, no, it would be pending for a while until the user actually gives an answer. So it wouldn't even be for a fraction, because it's not about just asking the question, it's about asking and waiting for the answer. So it could be minutes, because I may just walk away after running the program, not answer the question. That thing is going to be pending for that long, right? But I only care about when it's done, right? So I don't say like on fulfilled, But essentially, I'm saying onFulfilled, which is dot then. It's just a nicer way of saying onFulfilled. Yeah. That's the awkward pause, by the way.
I'm just a little bit confused as to like async, right? Is async a keyword in JavaScript? Like when you
Yeah, so unfortunately, async is also a keyword in JavaScript, but we are not there yet. So anytime I say an async function, I'm just mean a function that works asynchronously.
Okay, so
Yeah, which are two different things. Well, kind of two different things.
okay, so when you have an asynchronous function, right? It doesn't always have to return a promise, or it always returns a promise. What's up with that? Like,
Okay, so I don't want to get into what an async function is, like in terms of ES6 and like the new async await thing. Is that what you're asking about?
well, I just don't know, like, if
Okay, I'll answer your question quickly, but it's not for the sake of the class. Async await is promise-based. So if you want to understand async await, which is the thing we're going to not cover so much in bootcamp because it's actually easier, but the reason it's easier is if you understand promises. If you do not understand promises, because it works with promises, if you do not understand promises, you won't really fully understand async await.
promise is an object.
And promise is an object. And async await is promise-based, again. Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer fully. I can make an assumption. The question is like, what about the rejected state on specifically with read line? I think maybe if I do like Control C, it would be the rejected state. I think, but I don't want to say definitively. I have another example after this that's nothing to do with read line. We'll be using FS, which also uses callbacks, as you know. And we'll be using FS. You know how I said in my agenda, like I want to do a problem from scratch. So we'll do callback hell with it, and then we'll do promise based. Yep. Say that again. Yes, absolutely. I'm not showing you the error stuff in this example, but I'm going to show you error stuff in the other example. So errors are like part of my agenda. I just didn't write them down in the agenda, sorry. Good question. Great questions. Any others before we? Now it's 45 after, I'm just debating in my head. Do you think we should take a break and then do the solutions? Or do you think I should start on the callback-based solution? Well, we know what Jay thinks. What do you guys think? Take a break now or take a break a little bit like around 11? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Okay, why don't we start with the problem definition and things like that so that you at least know what we're going to be writing. And then maybe we'll get started with it, but I might give a break while still in it. It's kind of going to, it might be awkward. We'll see. So yeah, the next thing is a practice problem with file system. First using callbacks, and hopefully that won't take longer than, I'm going to say 15 minutes. I'm going to try to be faster than usual. So the problem is this. We have a bunch of files on disk, and I want to read them in sequence. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I want a final string at the end. Right? So again, it's a synchronous operation. I first need to read file 1, then I need to read file 2, then I need to read file 3, and so on. Okay? Because I need that sequence in order. If I didn't want them in order, I wouldn't care. I would just read them all in whatever order. And then I wouldn't have to really worry about like the callback hell as much, right? And these are the files. They're in a data folder, 4 files. And the files are actually just, in my case, I just wanted some kind of a funky example. So they're just 1 line each. Sorry, I misspelled that, but whatever. What is it, Agile? Isn't there like a website for Agile? Why is it not coming up? Ah, there it is. So this is when, no, this is not it, but whatever. Where was it? Anyway, there's like, if you look up the Wikipedia page, it's there as well. So Agile software development, you may have heard of it. There's 4 pillars, and so those are what the full files are. Here they are. Those are the main kind of pillars. They're literally just sentences written by software developers who were just frustrated with the heavy amount of documentation and administrative overhead. and essentially went the other extreme. So I don't necessarily know if I believe in Agile's extremes, but essentially this is what it tries to push, which is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So it's people-centric. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Like work with the customer, don't like just focus on contract negotiation. And responding to change over following a plan. So that's the main one that people think about when they think about Agile, is like being very like change oriented and not trying to think about everything up front. But anyway, that's not what this lecture is about. Those are just the things I took out and I said, let's make them into 4 different files. So here they are: individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and responding to change. And we just want those 4 in that order, even though the order doesn't really matter here. We want them in order, and that's the app we need to build, is to read all those in order. Okay, and we're going to do that with callback in this file here, which is empty, right? We're not going to use promises for this one. So how would I start with this? I'm going to use the FS library, right? I mean, I could do error-driven development and literally do fs.readLine. And I want to read what file? data/p1.txt. And I want to read it with UTF-8. And then because I'm using callbacks, the third argument is going to be. And yes, this callback should have arguments in it, but I'm working in small steps, right? So do I expect this to work? Not. It's going to fail. Why? Because fs is not defined. What file is this? Yeah, 1. fs is not defined. I need to go ahead and require fs. Is it read line? I think it's read line, right? Yeah, read line. Forget. OK, so once I run this, what do I expect to happen? I think it'll be nothing. I won't see anything, but I won't see any errors either, because I expect it to be successfully able to read the file. Right? Whoops, I guess it's not read line. What is the function called? Yeah, read file. We don't want to use sync, so we use read file, right? It's like this, isn't it? You're right. Sorry, I don't know why I said. I think read line is the other one that I was using. Yeah, sorry. It's read file. Let's just make sure. Node fs read file. Yeah.
Readline is for the input, right?
Read line is for that. Yeah, for that stuff. I just got confused. Let's go ahead and run it. Right. And what if the file name was wrong? What if that file, like this file doesn't exist? What do you think will happen? Would it throw an error? Is a great question. It wouldn't throw an error is your guess. I think that's correct. Why is that? That's not the. I don't think that's the exact right answer. Why is it not going to like literally show me the stack trace with like the error? No. Remember how callbacks and errors work in callbacks. You've already done it a little bit with file system before. How do errors actually get? How do you even look for errors if something with a callback fails? It's not actually throwing an error. Yeah, exactly. It's just an argument that we have to check with an if statement. So it'll just, because I don't have the if statement and I'm not accepting that argument, I won't even realize that there's an error at this point. Right? To me, it's going to be the same behavior as before, which is didn't work, but you didn't check. Right? And so this is why Node forces us, and many of its modules force us to first accept the error, so that we're forced. Because with JavaScript, you could just, if they didn't have error first, and we just had the data, you would just ignore, because you could just ignore error like that. So this forces us to not ignore error, because we have to accept the first argument first, which is error. Then you can still choose to ignore it, but at least it's obvious that you're ignoring it at that point, right? All right, and in there, I would have if error. Then I want to, maybe here I'll say console log success. And here I want to not get to this line, right? So I could either return, just for now, I could just return after a console log, right? But we can make that better. Not necessarily the best code, but it will work in terms of not letting me get to line 7 if there's an error. And we can see there is an error as expected because that file doesn't exist. However, if the file does exist, I get to see success. See how I'm working incrementally again? Again, it's about approach as well, not just about these concepts. And of course, I want to see the data, so I'll just concatenate it here because once there's no error, I expect there to be data, right? So here I expect to see that sentence. But now that I've read the first file, I want to read the second file, and so on. So that has to be inside this logic. It cannot be out here, because if it was out here, it would start reading both files concurrently, right? And I don't know which one it would read first successfully. So it has to be inside here, because once they're successful in that, and we'll just put maybe a variable out here. Let final document equal array, right? And we'll just push the data into that final document, right? Are you guys with me so far? Pretty quiet back there? With me? So of course, if I console log final document here, I expect to see one item in there, right? Incorrect. Tricked you. Why is that?
The read file happens later, and final doc happens first, but you don't have anything in final doc except for an empty array.
Yeah, so at line 13, I expect final doc to be empty. Did you expect it to be empty? This is important. This is like fundamental stuff before we get to promises. So I want to make sure, if you don't really know for sure, do you want me to explain that? Why is it empty on line 13, even though we added something to it on line 10? What's your name? Tausif has explained it, but that doesn't mean that you fully get it yet. And it's okay, just raise your hand if you're not sure why. So there's enough people here that we should spend some time on it. I'll spend a few minutes only, if that's okay. And if you still don't know, then you'll need to spend more time with mentors after. It's not just top down, right? You're right that here in line 10, it's before line 13, so what the hell? But JavaScript with callbacks, unfortunately, this is the confusing part, is that the control flow isn't top down, right? Read file is an asynchronous operation, and this here, this callback function, which has that arrow thing, which you can't see, so I'm going to close this. This callback function executes after line 13. So in your head, you're actually seeing this over here, even though written it's below. And that's because it takes time for Node or any application to go read a file. So it's ready to move on. Read a file, returns immediately. And then later on, is successfully able to call this function that we've added here, right? So we can say that this runs a few milliseconds later after read file returns, right? And so as a result, nothing is actually changed on final doc. It stays empty. Yeah, question?
What goes in that array? Like you're pulling data from the read file. Like,
Yeah, I didn't clarify that, so sorry about that. The data is a string.
but if it was like a big ass paragraph block of text, is it going to try and jam it in there?
Yeah, yeah. If it was a one, let's go beyond one. If it was a 50 gig file, this wouldn't work so well, because data would be 50 gigs of text, and it would probably result in some kind of memory error. Yep. Can you ask a little bit louder? Yeah. It will give whatever I'd want to give. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. You're not getting that, unfortunately, which is another challenge. It's a really good point, which is that stack trace that we like seeing. It's exactly. So, yeah, you're right. You're talking about if I throw a new error, right? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Yeah, same problem. But I don't want to spend too much time on that just yet. That's okay. So the people that were confused about why line 14 was an empty array, are you less confused about that? Or still just as much? Be honest. A little bit less? Okay, that's good. But if you're still not 100%, it's important to stare at that a little bit and try to explain it to yourself, try to explain it to your peer, or have the opposite, try to get a mentor to explain that to you. It's a very important concept. And that's a building block towards anything asynchronous, whether it's promises or anything else. Yeah, so we do see that array as empty. Okay, so really where this array is going to have something is going to be right after I push something into it. Because this here is not an async operation, it's a regular operation. So right after that, the array is going to have one thing in it. And I expect to see that, right? And now I want to start reading the next file. So right in this line, I'm going to do another read line, or read file rather, where I'm going to read p2.txt using UTF-8 and using a callback. And just like before, that callback will receive things. Now, I should call data maybe data2, because it gets, inside of that callback, I don't have access to the outside data. But the truth is, I don't need access to the outside data because I've already added it to the array. So I don't feel as guilty about giving this a different name and just keeping it same as data, as long as I'm storing it somewhere. And in this case, I'm adding it to the array, right? So same thing, if error, return console.log, failed on file 2, right? Maybe this one will say failed on file 1. Something like that. And then we'll do the same thing, which is, I don't need to console log it each time. So we're now adding the second one, right? Well, let's just console log it a second time, just to make sure that I now expect the final doc array to have two things in it, as we see in green, right? And then, of course, we keep going on this pattern of more and more. But ultimately, no matter how much we go further, line 21 will never have any of that data. So we'll always be stuck in this we'll be inside that thing in order to actually, so if we wanted that data outside, I just want it outside, right? I would have to maybe define a function out here which gets the entire final results, right? And then at the end, when I'm done with all four, let's just quickly copy paste and do the two others. So this is 3, failed on file 3, and then we do it one more time for file 4, failed on file 4, and now at the very end here, I could maybe call that function, what is it called, done? With final doc. And now at least I'm like, okay, I don't have to look at line 9 and below. I know that this will get me, this is where I get the final results, but it's still inside of a function, right? It's never going to be in the outer scope. As in, it's never going to be out here nested to the far left on line 38. I'm not going to have that because that stuff runs immediately. Do we agree? So here I could just say this is called when it's all done, and we're going to console log the final results, which is really final doc. I can console log final doc, same thing. And I have all four. At that point, I can do a dot join or something, and I have my paragraph of text, right? So it wasn't a lot of difficult work. But it was definitely, it resulted in code, again, with the same problem as our profile generator, which is a lot of nested callbacks. Right? If file 3 had a problem, we expect it to stop here, and we don't want it to continue. Do we agree? Because this whole problem is saying all or nothing, read them in order, and if there's a problem, don't bother. I want the 4 sentences in order, right? So if there's somehow file 3 is deleted, or in our case we have a typo and we're not targeting the correct file, I expect it to actually not get to done. I don't want to get here at all because I never finished. And I just want to know what happened. Right? It never gets to done because I returned and I did not continue with the next 2 callbacks or the next 2 read files. So with 1103 right now, we at least have the callback solution implemented. Mull it over a little bit. I'll keep it up on the screen. And we'll take a bio break of 10 minutes and re-adjourn at 15 after. Okay. I have to get my power as well.
Oh,
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah,
good.
yeah. Yeah, thanks for thinking about it. Actually, I'm going to also switch this to break. Yeah.
Whatever process dot standard in, like I require it. Right? Oh, sorry, I have to require this, and so I have to.
You don't have to require standard in, it's just there, but yeah.
And then the request. When I make the request, right, this is the query. So I have the query string. Sorry, whatever. Like if I do this, instead of right now, it's gonna give me Siberian cat no matter what I do, right?
Yeah, you want to actually get that from the user, right?
Like,
so first you have to use standard in to get, or read line, whatever, to get the string.
To get whatever they typed here.
Exactly.
Right? Like this.
Yeah.
And then
this is not going to be standard in, right?
Yeah, so
it is. No, that's going to be argv, right? Remember you did
Arg-
process argv before?
Right. So I have to do argv place pass that in as
But
the query.
yeah, but I don't remember if the assignment gets. Does it want you to do it this way, or does it want you to ask the user? I forget.
The compass.
Yeah, because you're working on the breed.
Yeah.
It wants it to be passed in like this.
Yeah, it wants.
So then that's argv, not standard in.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
See, I get confused like that. Like,
Yeah. No, it doesn't matter. You're just starting with this stuff.
I'm bad with like standard and file read. Like in my note, I don't.
Me neither.
Like
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
So, like,
That's why I also
me.
remember. Yeah, I don't, and also it's not important to remember.
Well, if you ask the other mentor, he said.
It's important to know the difference. It's not important to remember what it was called.
Mm.
Was it called argv or was it called something else?
Read,
Yeah, we can look that up. It's important to know the difference. Yeah.
Okay, so
Cool. I'm just gonna grab my power and then yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's at 6-ish. There's an employer one that happens at like I think it's like 4. So they start demoing privately at 4, and that happens like here, like in the main space.
Oh, okay.
And then there's like the presentation stuff, which is like on that TV over there. I don't know if you've been to a demo day
No,
before.
never.
It's pretty cool.
Because my buddy's in the one that's doing
Oh,
it
so you actually
today,
know
so
the one
know
that's
him.
graduating?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So I just
You get to see his demo.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't want to spend my whole night doing it, but
And you can even ask the staff like what the order is if you
Yeah.
just want to sit in for his.
Okay, sweet.
Because I think they prepared the order today. So if he's the first one, then you know what time.
Right.
Just ask like
They're not even all here yet, so I'll ask them throughout the day at some point.
Cool. That's pretty awesome. And some stickers. Good man, how are you? Oh, nice. This is our last day here, I think, right?
Yeah.
She's heading out tonight.
On 11:30 flight.
Oh my. Yeah, I knew she was staying Friday. I didn't realize it would be that. And that in Toronto time, that's like even later. Hank, I wouldn't do that.
No thanks. Hard no thanks.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's actually debate. Yeah, I just had coffee this morning.
Remy, I don't know how to do
No,
Lineup.
is
What I do with stickers is because I don't want to put them on my laptop.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I have one below, like under my laptop, which is the Lighthouse Labs one.
Right.
And then I have the duck one on mine, right?
Uh-huh.
But what I do is I take a lot of these stickers and I
Uh-huh.
stick them on suitcases.
Oh, suitcase.
Because like all the suitcases look the same.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's
then
true. I got it. Laptop. Accident. Mark on my.
oh, that's a smart move, yeah. Do you do like bullet journaling or something?
No, it's basically.
Notes. I think you showed it to me when you were like asking a question, right?
Yeah,
like you
yeah,
actually
yeah.
write code and stuff
Yeah.
like that with hand, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I write code. I mean, this is like.
It's good practice, right?
Like
Like
understand.
most people don't do this,
Yeah.
but then they're too dependent on the editor, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I usually do all these stuff.
And this will probably make you better at doing like whiteboarding questions and stuff
Exactly.
because you don't have an editor in front of you, right?
Exactly.
Most people get really nervous about that because
Yeah.
they're used to that.
Right.
That's
And
good.
I use the arrow. At this.
Yeah.
Going.
Yeah.
That I can.
In our first year, we had this student. He was an English major. He was an English teacher, sorry, and he had an iPad for notes. And most of the time, he would argue that like an iPad for notes not as good as tactile.
Oh no, it's not.
But like his notes were like, they were like a work of art. He
But-
would like use color and like go full on into like art. And it's like, well, I mean, I'm not sure how much you're learning code there, but holy shit, those notes look amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this work if you have a pen.
Yeah, he had a stylus.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. It was like, it was before iPad Pro, but it was still during the days of iPad.
Right.
So he was like using that.
I mean, this thing is in Surface. Like I did that on a Microsoft store. Right there, and I'm like, hey, can I just do something? Hey, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. No, I want to do something really much more than that. I want to sketch. I do that. Try that.
People do though.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And
I see
that-
stuff on Reddit all the
yeah,
time.
Exactly, and that came out really amazing.
You did it?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
I'm like, whoa.
Well, you need to know how to sketch.
Well, yeah.
So I guess you do because most people don't. Did you take art?
No, I didn't. It's kind of like I was into photography. It's what I was. I don't know. Maybe I used to do photography a lot. So that thing got into my head, and I was Photoshop to do everything. But before you do Photoshop, you have to like imagine in your head what you want to do. Right? So you sketch a little bit. From that onward, I just kind of like pick it up.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I envy people that have art skills. I have zero art skills.
I think
No music, no drawing.
I thought I had zero art skill as well, but before like doing the Photoshop, and when I started kind of doing that, I kind of like got the hang of it. Like if you start doing it right now, probably you're gonna take around 2 years to get really kind of. You have to, like any other thing, you have to kind of get into it. Right? I mean, I didn't do code much, so I started staying here till 11 at nights. Yesterday I went at.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so I was like, I think I have got a much more better perspective to codes than I had before. I know how things are running, and I can automatically pick it up in my head. Oh, okay, I need to do that.
Like
I can do
abstract
that.
thinking, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because of, you're saying because of art.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I know musicians actually tend to do well with code. Not always, it's a generalization.
Yeah.
But I was surprised to see like some of our like senior teachers actually were formally trained in music
Yeah.
and self-taught programmers, and they're like amazing devs.
I think the way they actually do it is because, like, I think
There's a lot of pattern recognition in music as
exactly,
well.
that's what I was
Yeah.
saying. That Travis said the other day that humans are extremely good at pattern recognition. Can understand how they're
Yeah.
running, can apply that pattern everything else.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. How was the mock test, by the way, on Friday for you folks? It was okay? Not too crazy? It'll be very similar coming tomorrow as well. Pretty much every Friday, almost every Friday. All right, we're 1 minute away from starting, so hopefully everybody's back. I forgot to switch to the whiteboard earlier, so here it is. This is what I had drawn. Essentially a state machine showing pending and then moving to fulfilled with a resolve arrow, and then from pending to rejected with a rejecting or rejected transition. It should actually just be called reject. This was a typo. It's like reject or resolve. All right. Welcome back. This is what we implemented earlier, where we have again simulated or shown that doing things in sequence with the async operations with callbacks results in quote unquote callback hell, or essentially nested callbacks that look like a staircase or waterfall. Any question about this? Yep. Great question. Apart from readability, is there any other drawback? There is another drawback. It's a little bit more complicated, but it has to do with automated testing, which is something you can relate to because you've done a little bit with Mocha and Chai, as well as in week 1 with your own assert statements. Testing a function that works with a callback is actually harder than testing a function that works with a promise. It's not impossible though, so it's again a convenience thing. That's another one. The other is that callback-based solutions make it really hard to do things like, for example, what if I wanted to read all the files in any order, so go faster, don't do one at a time, and then I want to have a done call when all of them are done. How would I do that? I wouldn't have to nest them, so it would actually be cleaner code from that perspective. So they would just be like stacked, right? Just read this, call back there. Read that, call back there, right? But how would I know when they're all done? See that it becomes harder, right? Promises help solve that problem as well. Or what if I wanted the solution of go do these 4 things, but let me know when the first one's done only. That is also easier with promises because you actually want to cancel the others once the first one's done. You don't have that control. More control with promises. Yeah. But that's getting into advanced uses of promises, right? That's why I'm kind of hesitating with this answer. Yeah.
Because they're chained together, that's why you have more control. Like one thing, like for that.
Kind of. Because they're composed in an object, you have more control. which is a weak answer. I wish I had a better answer. So I don't like my answer there, but it's a step in the right direction. Yeah, they're actually one of the reasons promises are hard because they're like kind of hard to explain fully, I find, or maybe I just struggle with it myself. I don't know. Okay, so we'll move on from this. We'll solve this problem again using promises, and this time we're not just looking at code that exists, we're actually writing it. So again, using incremental dev, we'll learn a few more things about promises that aren't kind of yet talked about. So let's start. So I'm going to use fs. However, fs is not promise-based. So if I actually Google node fs promises, it turns out that that is a different library, or not a different library, yeah, a different library, part of the same module. And it's still part of fs, but I have to specifically use, oh, it says stable now? That's new. Last month it didn't, or a few months ago it didn't. Usually this was a warning. But yeah, it's essentially like you do fs.promises, and then you can call functions on that object. Remember that when I require fs, I say fs.readFile, right? So fs is an object, because I did the dot thing there. So similarly, dot promises will give me another object. Let's just make sure, incremental development, that I know what I'm talking about there. We're just going to console log fs there, even though we're getting fs.promises into that variable. What is that file? 2. I expect to see a large object. Right? Object, but it has a lot of methods. This one's not about state. It's about just giving me a collection of functions that I can use. Similar to low tide, right? Which was just a collection of functions that we were trying to return at the end, so that we had a library of functions. This is a library of functions as well. They have to do with reading from the file system or writing to the file system. Specifically, we care about read file. So let's do it. fs.readFile. As you can imagine, first thing it's going to need is the path to the file. Second thing it's going to need is what kind of encoding the file is. Is it binary? Is it text? What kind of encoding? UTF-8 is the standard text encoding that you ought to be using. There are many others, but we're not focusing on that right now. And then the third one should be the callback? No. No callback for promise-based functions, because the callback is added afterwards with .then, as we saw earlier. Agreed? And again, we're working incrementally, so let's take advantage of that. What do we expect this will return? As we covered earlier before the break, a promise object. So let's actually assign that to a variable, even though we don't have to, and then console log it to see what the hell it is. Right? Incremental dev all the way. It will save your life. Whoops, sorry. So I expect to see, always have a hypothesis, I expect to see a promise object of some sort. Don't know exactly what it will look like. Okay. Hold on. There's got the other console log up there that's just causing it to not look really appealing. What does it say? I mean, forget the second line for a second. I'll explain it. What does the first line say? I have a promise, which is an object with the curly brackets. And it's also giving me, it's nice because it knows it's a promise. Node is basically like, oh, it's a promise. Let me show you the main thing that you care about, which is its state. Now, you would argue like, oh, it has .then. Why doesn't it show me those things? It's just formatting it because it knows it's a promise. It assumes you know that it has a .then. It doesn't show you that it has .then. Now, fs promises has been unstable because it's been a new feature. So they just marked it as stable in like version 6. We're still on Node. I think I'm still on Node. Well, the version number is very confusing. Anyway, I'm on an older version of Node. So it's still experimental in my version. So it's giving me a warning not to use it, or to use it with care, as in maybe think twice. But that's kind of, we're not worrying about that. I could be using HTTP, by the way. You know how you used the request library yesterday or last night? Some of you probably got to that. That's callback based. But then later on today, your assignment in Compass, this like cat stuff, that you remember the cat stuff that you guys did? Later on today, you'll be doing cats again. And we'll make reference to the page downloader thing that you'd already done. I think that was the one with the request, right? If I recall correctly. except this time you will, oh no, sorry, this one is just with request. I don't think is this one with promises? No. So if this one is without promises, like regular, then you will do it with do something similar with promises, but not the cats thing. And then you'll build a larger assignment with promises. Right? Actually, no, sorry. You'll build ISS spotter with callbacks, again without promises, and then with promises at the end. Just a caveat here, today's kind of heavy, kind of like the Wednesday of first week. So you may don't get stressed if you do not fully get to ISS with promises fully done by the end of the day. Right? So just a warning about that. Because what does it say on the left side there? It says 8 hours, but and that's based on estimates as well as actuals, like what previous cohorts have done. So these numbers change over time. But you know, still it's a pretty heavy day compared to yesterday, for example. Okay, where were we? Yeah, so we saw the promise, and that looks good. I want to know when the promise is resolved, though, because I want to actually get the data, right? So what do you think I'm going to do? Then, and this is what takes the callback. Now, it does not. Normally, the callback takes error and then data. Do you recall? This one does not. It only takes the data. So another thing gets cleaned up, which is error handling. So you asked me earlier, another benefit of promises, error handling is much easier. I forgot to mention that, as we'll see. Don't have to worry about errors and kind of the separate function to deal with errors, which I'll talk about near the end. So very, very incremental development. I just want to make sure I can look at the data, right? Is that okay? So we have to keep ignoring this experimental warning and just look at the next line here, which is the data itself, right? The string from the file. Individuals and interactions over processing tools. This isn't crazy confusing, right? I don't think. In fact, this is taking a callback-based thing and turning it into still a callback-based thing, but just there's a function that you have to call to attach the callback. So nothing crazy, hopefully. Hopefully the developer in you wants to also is like, can we please console log P1? I want to see what that looks like, because that is a good next step. What does P1 look like? Any suggestions? Is it going to say pending? No. Fulfilled, or something of that nature. Now, it doesn't show fulfilled. It actually just shows the value that it fulfilled to, or the value that it resolved to is probably the better way of saying it. Resolved to a value, but its internal state is fulfilled. In fact, do promises, I don't want to digress too much, but like, do promises, can you actually access the state? I don't actually know. Maybe it's like dot state or something. See, some people, by the way, use the word, instead of fulfilled, it's, it's settled. So fulfilled, settled, successful. No such inspection API exists. So you cannot actually be like dot state and see the string fulfilled. Who cares? That's not really something you should need to worry about, because you have other ways to kind of deal with that. What's next? What do I do next? I need to read the next file. Right?
Check for error.
Oh yeah, check for error. I want to leave the check for error for last, just because it's different. You're right. I normally should be doing it now, but just in the lecture sequence, I'm going to kind of leave it to the end. I want to read the next file. Now you can still do callback waterfall or callback hell with promises if you do them wrong. So here I could be like, okay, I'm in line 11, I'm inside a callback. I need to do P2 equals fs.readFile, right? And follow the same pattern. And now I've basically ended up in callback hell. Yep.
Are you missing something from that dot then?
Sorry, yeah, I was supposed to put data in here. Is that what you mean?
No. From the whole P1 dot then. Like, because you're asking about how to not end up in nested hell.
No, actually, I'm not missing anything in the code that I wrote. It was basically, what do I do next? So,
Yeah, what was at the bottom of it in the last piece of code? Like, can you show the first one that you showed before the break?
oh, the readline one? So that was 0b.
The return. Are we missing the return?
Yeah, I'm getting there. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
nailed it. No, that's a good eye.
I just
Uh,
don't remember exactly what.
No, you're right. It's the return. So this is going to expose another property of promises that we don't yet know. Return, but why? So I'm going to explain that a little bit. So I can, coming back to what I was saying, I can still end up in the, if I don't fully understand promises, I can still use them wrong, and it'll work just the same way as callbacks, no advantages.
It would still go to the next question? Like,
Yeah, I can just, I get another promise back, I do a dot then, but it's now I'm nesting callbacks again, right? So I can show you the wrong approach. We're already starting to see that pattern emerge here, where I'm now 1 level in, and now I'm 2 levels in, right? And then in here, I would say, oh, by the way, I have to have my array of final document, right? So here I would push, right? Push data. And then here I would do final doc dot push data. And so on. And then I would, again, create another right? This is doing it the callback hell way again with promises. Since promises need callbacks anyway, you can easily go into callback hell if you're not careful. So let's call that the wrong approach. And we'll just comment it out. And, well, at least we'll take this part. So coming back to where we were, what we don't want to do is start another promise internally, because then we have to deal with the callback for that internally, and then we get into that nested callback situation. So actually what we do is we return a promise. So one of the other nice attributes about promises is if the .then function returns a promise, no, you know what? Before I get into that, what happens if I just return a value? When I do a .then here, on top of this .then, I can. That's the crazy part. I can do that. I can do a .then here. So promises will guarantee that their .then will always return, will always allow me to do another .then, even though I'm returning a thing here. Right, because I'm not, remember that this is returning a string, but this is the callback function returning a string. I'm not calling it on the callback function. I'm calling it on the .then's return value. I think people were like, wait, you're returning a string, so string.then doesn't exist. But I am returning a string, but this whole .then is returning a promise still.
yeah, because it's not a dot then on the return value.
Exactly, that's correct. That's what people were confused about. You realized it, but some people, like I can see the confusion around, wait, string came out, how can you do string.then? But string didn't come out. I returned a string here, but this whole thing still returns a promise. Right? And so the question is, what is this data 2, if I were to call it that?
Nothing?
It is the previous return value. So you can pass the return value through to the .then. Because it makes sense. You want the previous thing, whatever it computed, in your next .then probably. Just like if you're writing synchronous code, let a equals whatever, you want the value of a next time to be able to use it.
That's automatically going to fill that too.
Exactly. So this is another attribute of promises, is that you can pass evaluations from one .then to another. Kind of needed in synchronous computation. So what I expect here is if I do data 2 is it will say data2 is hello, because hello was passed back from the first dot then. So this is an attribute of promises. One attribute is that there's a state machine in there. Another attribute is that it has .then functions. The other attribute is the .then functions return a new promise. So promises .then return promises. These combined allow us to do what we need to do. Yeah.
Okay, so to, I guess, finish the exercise, you would, instead of returning hello, you would return a new promise.
Actually, before I get to your question, I'm going to start writing these down because they're in our head. And these attributes, let's write them down as we go, as we discover them. So I think it's under what are promises. So there's the analogy. We'll write that down separately. But we'll say that they are objects. Which means they have state and behavior. They have a state machine, specifically from pending to either fulfilled or rejected, right? They have a .then function. They have another one, which is called .catch for errors, but we'll get there, which takes a callback. .then function, a callback is only executed when fulfilled successfully. Okay. This is kind of false, actually. The .then can be called on failure depending on how you want to use it, but let's just assume simple use case. .then is only executed when fulfilled. And also another attribute of .then is .then returns a promise, a new promise, not the same promise. So that means it starts again at pending. And the reason we actually could have looked at the initial code that I showed you, and we could have deduced this. I'll show you why. Let's look at the very original code we looked at, the survey. .then, the return of the .then, I'm calling .then on. The return of the .then, I'm calling .then on. And we know .then exists on a promise. So that means .then returns a promise in order for me to chain that. But I didn't want to get into that right away when I was showing you that code. That would have been confusing at first, right? Do you see it? Right? It's a promise coming out of each one, and it's a new promise each time. Even though my code did not return a promise. What if it returned an object? Right? What do you think data 2 will be? It's a good guess, right? It was whatever value was returned. If it was an array, same deal. Yeah.
So if like that previous example, like question basic, that returned a promise object. So node wouldn't put the promise object inside of the promise object to the next then.
So that's what we're getting to next, which is you're talking about this here, but it returns a promise object here. Is that what you're asking? That's what I want to talk about right away. Because that's the next question is, okay, fine, great. But that's great. We don't want to return a string. We want to start doing another async request, right? So let's actually show you another attribute of promises. There's just so many different ones. Again, hard to teach. Is that what happens if I return a promise? And we know we can return a promise. This is what gives us a promise, right? So here I'm going to return a promise because I'm going to return the next thing I want to read, which gives me back a promise. Agreed? We know that because the first one gave us a promise, P1. I mean, I could assign that to a variable, but really I'm just going to return that variable, right? So that's just unnecessary. That's why I just go ahead and say, nah, I'm just going to return whatever comes. Same thing, right? And we know that this is a new pending promise saying I will read the file too. So we said that when .then returns a value, the next .then will have that value as an input. But it's different with promises. So if you return a promise, that is something that's a special situation. So it goes, oh, this is a promise. Do you think that data 2 will be the promise itself? No. It will be the resolution of that promise. So this is attribute number 3, if you will, which is if our .then callback returns a promise, then the returned promise, this is getting really confusing, will be the resolution of that previous promise. So in other words, this is a really confusing one. I'm going to rewrite this again because this is a really confusing sentence. This .then now, let's say this is a 2 GB file, right? It won't just be like, cool, there's a promise, time to move on. It's going to wait for that 2 GB file to be completely read before it executes this .then's callback function. Because we need the actual value of what was read. So that's another property of promises, which is you return a promise, your next .then in the chain, in the outer chain, right here, your next .then, will be the resolution, assuming that promise was successful, of that promise that you just returned, allowing you to chain promises without having to nest them. This is where shit gets confusing. So it's OK if you're like, I don't get it. Let's work with it a little bit, and hopefully over time you'll get it. And this is what I meant when I said you won't get all of it right away, right? So here, data 2 now will not be a promise value, even though I'm returning a promise value. It will be the resolution of that promise. What is it going to resolve to? The data actually inside of p2.txt. Question?
If it didn't do that, and data 2 was
The promise? I'd have
that's when you'd have to start.
I'd have nested callback problems again. That's exactly it. You're seeing it exactly how I want you to see it. Yeah. That's why they had to choose when whoever invented promises was like, I need it to be this way so that I can not nest this shit, right? So let's confirm that data 2 should now be the second sentence, which is whatever's in p2.txt, which is working software. Okay. And so here, we can do the same thing, right? Actually, we're forgetting to keep pushing the data. So final doc, we need to push that data, right? Final doc dot push p, not p1, data. And then here, same thing. We can just call it data here. It's a different function, right? And so this part, final doc, this is p2, right? And then we return for the next one. So this one's going to now be for p3. No semicolon, by the way. Why no semicolon? Exactly. I'm not ending that. It's a chain on the same line. So technically, it's actually right here. You're not going to have a semicolon before you do that, right? See that? So I'm continuing the previous line. That's why I'm keeping it on the same indentation. Yeah. Question from Jay? Go ahead.
So, like, this is technically not nested, right? So everything, because you're doing .then, you're chaining it, they're all like on one scope, right? So if you needed some sort of like calculation or variable from inside the .then, you can like have it outside, right? Each of the .then has access to the top level scope.
No, this is not nested scope. Therefore, I don't have access in this function to this data.
But after you will?
Nope. It's actually, that's one of the drawbacks, is I cannot just call this, if I call this data 1, this data 2, this function will not have access to data 1. It'll just say data 1 not found. Completely different scope, not nested inside. This function is not nested inside of this function, so how will it have access to that outer scope?
So if you needed to like, say like you have three things, right? Chaining, and you needed like
All three, I'm going to if we have extra time, I'll show you another technique. Right now, how I'm maintaining that is through this outer function, is this outer value that is actually outer from everything, and I'm able to append to that, right? Able to push to that. But there's another technique I could use that's a bit more advanced. Again, I don't know if I want to show it to you, which is just more like, how do I not keep this out here? But I don't usually show that in this lecture. I'll maybe say, if you're curious about that, take the solution, try to do it yourself, or ask a mentor for help. But given what you know, all the attributes about promises, you should be able to ideally figure out. There's nothing new. It's just a matter of using promises in a more clever way, right? Do you think it's easier if I call these data 1, data 2, data 3, just for readability? Yeah, right? So far, so good? Right? And I think I missed one here. And we're good there, I think. What happens if I do... What's that going to be? Empty. Correct. Empty. Because these are still inside of a callback, right? They're happening, even though they're not nested, each inside of another, it's still happening a little bit later due to the async nature of JavaScript. And then I think we have one more to do. Is that right? But it's going to be the same. Copy that. 4, 4, 4. And now, here, I have final doc being completed. I still cannot, just like before, I cannot look at final doc out here. So if I had that function done, I would call it here after line 30. Yep. Ask your question again. No, that's a really good question. They would not collide because they are different callback functions. Remember that arguments in a function are just local variables for that function. So here, the scope of the function starts here and ends here. And I decide to call it data there. That's fine. That function, that variable data is no longer available outside of that function. And then this is a completely different non-nested scope that is not at the same, not below this scope, but at the same level, and therefore it has its own local variable called, let's say, call it data again. Doesn't matter. Do you see that? Once it's nested, though, you're right that it collides, right? Like in our very first file, where we do this. Whoops, sorry. Where we do this. If we called it 1 each time, I would not be able to refer to all of them because it's nested scope. I needed to give them different names. I could have given them the same name, but then I'm losing access to the one above because this is nested, right? Nested scope. Do you see it? Here, scope is not nested. There's nothing, this function starts and ends there. There's nothing nested inside of it. Great question. I don't know what to return there, right? What do I return there? I don't want to do another promise. For now, I'll just won't return anything, right? But we could maybe think about that a little bit. And there is a right answer. There's a good answer here. I'm just not giving it to you yet. But don't worry about that. We'll come back to that. Ultimately, though, if I console log, I can console log done here, just because I am done at that point after 4. And I can say final doc is... And I can just include final doc here, right? I'm going to remove these. Should I remove these console logs? They might confuse us. Let's see. Let's run it and see how noisy it is. Let's also remove this console log p1 thing. And we don't need it here either. So we're console logging at each time. But then at the end, we're also console logging the final array. Cool? Say that again?
Like, on then data tray, we use ChatGPT for
Oh, yeah, good call. There we go. No, wait. Oh, hold on. 1, 2, 3. So that should be 3. And then this one is 4. Oh, but I see what you're saying. This one should be 4 here. Yeah, you're right. My bad. See, I'm already, yeah. Okay. So is that the right file? 2 promises. Okay, so what I expect to see is each one is console logging because we have that for debugging purposes. But then this is what we care about, which is the done. The final doc is the array, the final array. Well, that is a good question. And that's a little bit more advanced, but we have 10 minutes left, so I did better in this lecture than I normally do, which is I go over time. Now, I also want to cover creating a promise. So I think what I'll do is I'll, first of all, questions, and then I want to talk about this return, actually. And then we'll talk about creating promises. So we might still go over time, we'll see. Questions? Aside from Jay, I'll get to Jay if nobody else has questions. That's why you're always last. Okay, Jay? Here?
Like when you ran the file, right? It worked, and you didn't have a return in that last then. So I'm just like reading between the lines here that you actually don't need to return anything.
You don't, because we saw that the done is there.
Yeah.
So you don't need to. It's about software craftsmanship at this point,
Right.
which is what if I wanted to say, put this in a function? You know, create a library that, or a library function in low tide that, and maybe we won't make it super generic because I have limited time, but like we'll just say it's supposed to read these 4 files. So you have to hard code these 4 files. And I want it to, like, I just want it to give me the final array, right? How would I do that? I want to encompass all of this code starting, I guess, line 7 into its own function. Can we do that? Maybe we'll do that before we create a promise. Okay. So here's how that would be. Const read 4 crazy files equals, well, maybe not say crazy agile files, equals, it's a function. Now, normally you'd take in the file names or whatever, but we're just going to skip that, right? Just takes that in. And all of this stuff should be in there. What should this function return? Reads all of the 4 files and returns I didn't do yet, but you're on to the right track.
You console logged it.
I console logged it,
Return it.
but maybe I return it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to return final doc. Okay, as you suggest. And then I'm going to call it. This is not the correct answer, as you'll see, and I want to kind of get into why. But you're on the right track. Let's go ahead and run this function. So I guess it would be below. And then I don't need to pass in anything because we're being lazy on that front. And I want to console log what comes back, right? Something like that? Is that OK? What is it returning? Undefined is the correct answer. This function is returning undefined. I do not see a return from this function. These things inside are returning stuff, including final doc at the very end, but this is being returned from this function. That is a nested function. Are you in agreement that this is going to return undefined in this current state? And do you understand why? If not, please raise your hand. Don't be shy. Do you understand why this is returning undefined? There's a return right here. What the hell? This return is not directly in that function. This is this function. Now it's going to return KV. And it's immediate, right? Because it's an asynchronous function, so it's returning right away. And before I didn't have this, it was undefined, as somebody said out here. Right? So what can this function actually return the array? Can I do return final doc right here then? It will be an empty array. It is an asynchronous function. It cannot return the value. So I have two ways of returning data from this function. What are those two ways? You've learned one today and one yesterday, or day before yesterday. Two ways that we can do asynchronous return values. Callback. So I can say this function takes a callback, and in that callback, I will get the data. That's going to be my result. So I'm going to comment this out for our notes right here. And instead, we will call the function and take in the result as a callback to your, as an argument to your callback. Because this is the nature of this function is asynchronous. And then in order to actually make this work, because right now we won't see a result, this is not calling our callback. We need the function to actually take in a callback. Right? Let's call that callback done. And let's call it when it's done, which is, instead of that, we'll say call done, and please pass in the final doc. Whoops, sorry. That return is useless to us, right? Right there. Do you see that? Calling done, passed in to read 4 agile files, to be called when it's completely done, and then it will pass in the final array. This is the callback approach. But we learned another way, which is through promises. So here it is, result, works. And it works at the end, because we get the result at the very end. Question before I show you the promise approach? Yep.
Is it actually like, so that promise is like closed and finished? It's not like an open event listener still waiting?
No, yeah, it's cleaned up through the garbage collector and whatnot. Yeah, yeah. Dynamic languages like JavaScript and Ruby and Python and PHP, you don't actually clean up after yourself. The thing keeps track of all your variables, and when you're stopped, when you just don't need it anymore because you've done with that function, eventually it gets garbage cleaned. And like if you're writing C, you'd have to like deallocate.
And would that promise ever be restartable?
No, promise. Oh, by the way, promise. Once you get there, you cannot go. This is one of the attributes: is that it's a one-way state machine. There's no arrow going back.
So essentially, it's really only for asking the program to listen to questions in sequence.
As in, promises can only be used for that? No, no, no.
So you have to like recreate a new promise?
Yeah, but we're indirectly creating a whole bunch of promises. So if I asked you how many promises are being created in this, I've got 1, right? This returns a promise, which then the dot then returns another promise on top of that. So that's 1, 2 from this one, 3 from this one, not in that order exactly, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I believe there's 8 promises in here that are being created. I know that part is really confusing, so
Well, I'm wondering, because you put
Yeah, this is.
Would that sort of be redundant if you're only going to use those promises just to ask a list of questions that are only going to get answered once, like theoretically, and then like you're not going to ask somebody, you're not going to.
Yeah, promises are use once and throw away for sure.
Okay.
That's why we have 8 here, and that's one of the reasons is to keep it clean and simple. Go from one to the other. You don't have a recyclable promise. So yes, it is causing more memory usage. If your question is this more memory usage than the other solution? I think maybe yes. I'm not sure, but maybe yes.
So if you ever needed to, okay, never mind, I'm getting off.
You're getting into like optimization and stuff. This might not be the most optimal memory-wise, but it might be the most optimal in terms of maintainability and all of that, right?
Right, and then
Yeah.
not have to nest all your.
Exactly. That's maintainability, right? Yep. Question?
For how dot then work, it's like, so dot then itself returns a new promise, and you're accessing that promise with the following dot and dot then. But the promise that returns, the promise that is returned inside dot then is accessed by.
Not data 2. It's actually done automatically behind the scenes. It's resolved, and once it's resolved, it then calls our second dot then with a new promise.
So that whole dot then is not accessing SS reflux, right?
I'm not 100% certain on that, actually, so I'll have to read up on that. But I'm pretty sure this dot then is operating on a new promise returned by dot then, not the same promise that this returns, but don't quote me on it. That's a little bit more of an advanced question, and I don't think it needs to be answered right now. I didn't understand your question, unfortunately.
And then that line of text is coming through to the next line. Oh, and the next one.
Okay, the reason file doc works here and keeps state is because it's outside. So it's outside of all of this stuff, and therefore it's available to any of these things. Data 2 is a string. It's not a promise, right? Because when I output it, I see it's a string. This is the confusion that I said. By the end of lecture, you only just practice this stuff, right? Lecture doesn't get you to go, I don't understand promises now. Let me like move on from this. You'll need to practice this. Even by the end of today, you'll be like, like I need more days with this, and that's totally fair. So I'm going to leave there, even though you're not fully clear. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. That's why we're introducing promises earlier. It's a little bit of a mind bender, right? I didn't get to a couple things. So we're at 12:01. I'm going to go a little over time, unfortunately. This function returned a callback, or not returned, but it used a callback to return the value. The other approach is to use promises. And what that would look like is I would not pass in the callback, and I would just say dot then, and then pass in the callback. Right? And to make that work, I'm going to comment this out because it's no longer going to work. All I have to do is here, right? Return final doc, which is what we were going to do originally. And then here, return this whole thing. What the what? Well, think about what I'm returning here. I'm not returning P1. What is this expression that I'm returning? It's this whole freaking thing. So I'm actually returning the overall evaluation of what this returns, which remember, when a dot then returns something, it's the thing. It's not a promise. This is the array. So when dot then returns an array, that's what gets returned. I'm returning the array here. Sorry, I'm not returning the array. I'm returning a promise. My mistake. I'm returning a promise. I'm returning a promise that has the array as part of its resolution. Right? Obviously, because yeah, my bad.
Yeah, I thought I understood.
You think it's yeah. You think this is easy to understand. It's also you think it's hard to understand. It's also hard to teach. Question?
It's gonna do the same thing then?
What you call it's returning.
I'm returning a promise that came from my final dot then.
No, I know. So that promise does the same thing. Like, cause that's what sort of plays on my last question. If you can't make that dynamic, like passing variables in and out and all over the place, why would you ever do that? Like, why would you ever do what you just showed?
This is actually good. This is actually better than the callback solution because now all I have is a function that says it's asynchronous. It can be promised.
Reading those four
It is. It's reading those 4 files and it's going to give me a final array.
only, right?
Yeah.
So, in a sense, you might use that if those files are getting updated and you need to reread text from it again.
Sure. Yeah. I guess. Yeah. I mean, I didn't. Yeah. The use case isn't super realistic.
That's why
Um,
I'm just wondering.
Like maybe you'd pass in the name of the files as well, right? Why are they hard coded is kind of stupid. But those are just because it's an example.
But so you could pass it the name of other files.
Yeah. That would be like I just don't have time to refactor it further.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to
Yeah.
know if that was like theoretically.
Yep. Yeah. Because theoretically possible because I can have file names here, and then I would just reference them here, right? So now I've got essentially a promise-based function. The user doesn't know that there's a whole bunch of other promises and stuff involved there, just that it returns a promise with the final result. We still haven't talked about errors, so I kind of need to curb questions, sorry. And I want to talk about errors, and then I'm going to talk about, we're going to go to 12:15, I think. So sorry about that. This is just tough. Okay, so errors. We didn't talk about errors, and I definitely don't want to stop lecture without errors, right? Like that would be implying that errors are not important. They're just as important, if not more. So there is no error handling in here, which is so clean and nice. There's no if statement. So what you actually do is you have a dot catch right there for your errors. And you say, if any of these things that are happening in sequence result in an error, it will not continue on. So let's say it happened here, after this one, after the first one, it failed on 2. It will not execute callback 3, callback with 3, and callback with 4 because it will not proceed. So that would mean that this promise that was being returned was rejected. And instead of going into the next one, it will actually jump to the catch. Very, very nice and elegant. Right? And let's actually cause that by changing the name of the file because it's like the wrong file name or something. And we see the oh no and the results undefined. Now, I would argue that this function, because it's returning a promise, it shouldn't even do the dot catch. It should let the outside do the dot catch, which is really nice. So I would actually move this dot catch out here, right? You're calling the function to read a bunch of files. On success, you want something, and on failure, you want something. And because you're getting the promise back, you can decide where that error handling logic goes pretty easily. Because ultimately, the object will give you dot thens as well as dot catches. We can even, I forgot to output the error message itself. Oh no, and then it's could not open the file. We even know which file it failed to error. Like we know where it failed or why it failed. Yeah, it's just an error object. Yeah.
So it breaks the promises altogether.
It's the same error object, by the way, that we would have had with the callback approach. If you console log the error, it's the same error. Yeah, sorry.
So it would, the catch error would break the promises no matter where it fails. I mean, so for example, data 1, data 2 passed, but data 3 couldn't do it. So catch error within that promise object where it called in the very beginning, which is at the very last. Yeah, this one. So it failed, hence data 3 didn't go past, so it would catch the error and output it on the function itself.
So the logical sequence of events is this promise resolved successfully. This promise failed to resolve, which means that, and remember, it has to wait for it to resolve before it can call the next dot then, right? So it's like, okay, I guess I know that it didn't resolve, it rejected. And so because it rejected, it does not, it returns it basically returns a promise that was rejected, and therefore our dot catch is what actually gets triggered. So this would be, knowing promises, this is the best possible solution. I mean, I've hard-coded the file name, so that kind of sucks. But in terms of using promises, now it returns the question mark that I put. Right? I mean, it'll return the promise regardless, but not really necessarily with the results. Just with the promise. It could be with the results or with an error, right? Just don't get confused by looking at this thinking this returns P1, because that's the initial promise. It returns this entire expression in this one line. That's why the semicolon is only at the end there. And so really what it's returning is a promise that's wrapped around this final doc. Assuming it worked. If it didn't work, it would not even get to this, and it returns the rejected promise that came out from wherever it failed. Little confusing, I know still, but this will take a little bit of time to get comfortable with. Yep.
Two quick little questions. So basically, if you are returning an async function, then it would return a promise, right?
Yes, async functions return promises, but we're not talking about that stuff in this lecture.
That's
Yeah.
fine. So, and the next question is, if it was not returning any async function, say for example that string that you showed, right? It's returning a string. Then data3 would take that string value, right? The output of that dot then is a string. So data3 would be a string right now. The output of the promise of that.
If I did a return data3,
Yeah.
if I did a return data3, then I have a promise that returns the.
If the previous promise returned a string, so
Yeah.
data2 returns.
Yeah, if data2 returns a string,
Yeah.
then data3 will just be that string.
Exactly. And so since data2 is not returning any promise, can I call dot then on that? Because I mean, I can call dot then on a promise.
Here's what I've started to realize with these questions is that they're very specific to your mental model of what you're realizing.
Right.
And it's better to ask these questions when you look at the code with the mentor, just because you'll be able to play with it and do that, if that's okay. Because I can imagine the rest of the class is like, I don't know what these guys are talking about. Because it's specifically a question to like what you're trying to answer. And it's not doing anybody else any favors. I do want to spend like 5 minutes showing you creation of a promise, even though, by the way, that's at the end of the day today. And the reason, and it's very little time spent, because again, get used to using promises, worry about functions that create promises separately. So I'll still spend time on it, even though I marked it as stretch in my agenda. As you can see here, it's marked as stretch. And then definitely this is stretch as well. So you can read up on that separately, right? Not a big deal. So promise creation. Very, very simple. Let's say we have a function that's going to return a promise. Now, adding numbers is not asynchronous, so you have to use your imagination a little bit, because that one, like, why would you return a promise? That makes no sense, right? It's not asynchronous. But we can still do that. So we would return a new promise, and that's what it looks like. And the promise, like this is valid code, except it's not complete because you don't have anything to do the actual arithmetic. So what we do is we don't do the arithmetic synchronously, we do it asynchronously in a callback. And this is what a callback looks like. And then here, instead of returning a plus b, because remember, returning from a callback doesn't mean that the function actually returns anything, this outer function. We're actually not going to do that. We're going to have, I think it's resolve reject or reject resolve. Resolve reject. We're going to then say, okay, resolve with the answer. And that is as simple as it gets in terms of creating a promise. The simplest, a simple promise. Not a lot of code. Still confusing in terms of what the hell's going on. But essentially there's a callback function. There's 2 callback functions there. Resolve and reject. These are functions. And I am calling them. So that's a callback function. Okay? And I'm saying I'm ready to resolve with an answer. I have an answer for you. This is a success. This is this function here. It's going to fulfill if I call that function. If I call reject, it is going to end up in the dot catch. Let's actually see it in action. Add numbers. 1 and 2. If I console log the value of r, what is it? What is the function returning? No. It's a pretend asynchronous function. Look at the return statement. What is it returning? Yes, and that object is of type? Promise. It's returning a promise. Return new promise. Guess we're a little tired. That was a long, crazy lecture. I apologize. This is a tough one. Anyway, it's returning a promise. So I expect to see promise, but it won't be pending because it's so quickly resolved. It's synchronous. It'll actually already have the result in it. Whoops, sorry, wrong file. It'll automatically already be resolved to 3. So because it's synchronous, we don't even get to see it in the pending state. Any ideas on how I can make this async addition? How can I do the addition so it takes like 100 milliseconds to do the addition? Set timeout. Exactly. So let's do that. So now it's actually going to be async, even though there's no need for us to take 100 milliseconds to do this math. Right? So the first thing is a function. The second thing is the delay. And then we move our resolve into there. Right? So now, when I console log r, its state is not going to be 3 because there is a delay, and its state is going to be pending. Right? Because it takes time now. How would I actually get the value back? How would I get the 3 out of this promise? Dot then. There's only so many functions these promises have. And we know that's a sum, so we can call that local argument a sum. And we can just say, if this were to do a reject, then r dot then is not going to be called. And in fact, I want to show you this, because you will come across this. What do you see? It sounds really obscure. Unhandled promise rejection warning. Unhandled promise rejection, this originated either by throwing inside of an async function without a catch block, or by rejecting a promise which was not handled with a catch. We definitely had a rejected thing that we didn't handle with a catch. And it's also being like, by the way, in the future, these rejections that are not handled will terminate the process with a non-zero code. So they're going to change the behavior of node, and they're giving us a heads up, because that will change production code, right? But anyway, you don't want this error, this warning in your code. It means you did something wrong, because you should be doing a dot catch if something has a possibility of being rejected. Well, we have the dot then, which I'm just going to indent so it's easier to read, and then dot catch. And then here I have an error. Let's console log the error. Now the truth is I'm not rejecting with an error. I'm rejecting with I'm rejecting with the 3 as well, right? So that's not really the right way to do things, but we get the rejection of the 3, which doesn't make any sense. Normally you would have a reject. So you'd have your resolve, a plus b, or in some weird case, maybe in some else case, you'd do a reject with a new error saying some error, right? And then that would be your error message.
So if you do new error, you can type whatever.
Yeah, that's the syntax for that. So I wanted to include that. It's not anything crazy. It'll be in the notes. Now, creating promises, not going to be handling that till end of day if you get to it. Okay? It's the other stuff that we covered for the majority of the lecture. Most people, not most people, a lot of people that introduce promises, if you watch the videos, will start with, instead of how I started, they'll start with, how do you create a promise? So I don't know if it's better or not. I find it's better to keep it to the tail. I think it depends on preference. But I believe the videos that you have for today might start with creating a promise first, then dealing with its return values and stuff. So it's more constructive versus destructive, the way I started. Right? Is that cool? Sorry for such a long lecture. This is always a tough one for me. But enjoy the rest of your day, and by enjoy I mean good luck getting your ass kicked. Cheers.